They say every legend starts with a rumor, but Jada River's story didn't begin with whispers. It began with a sound I will never forget, a low, cold crack echoing across the training deck, as if the night itself was warning us that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Make sure to like and subscribe if you believe that the strongest warriors are the ones nobody sees coming. Because what I witnessed that night was the birth of a force none of us were ready to face. I was standing against the chain-link fence behind the barracks at Coronado, the Pacific wind pushing salt through the air, the horizon glowing faintly with the last streaks of dusk, and right in the middle of that fading light stood Jada, 28 years old, barely over 5'6", compact, quiet, and carrying herself with a calmness that, at the time, we mistook for uncertainty. We had all seen candidates break before, brutally, spectacularly, but Jada wasn't breaking. She was simply absorbing everything, filing away each insult, each smirk, each laugh like she was memorizing a script she would one day rewrite in blood and sweat. And trust me, the Marines who mocked her had no idea they were setting the stage for their own humbling. I remember the exact moment it began. Staff Sergeant Colt Maddox, built like a bulldozer and twice as loud, came stumbling out of the locker room with 6 other Marines, all of them riding high on their usual cocktail of arrogance and boredom. "Try not to cry, Queen," he sneered at her, and I swear the chuckle that followed rippled through the deck like oil on water. Jada didn't lift her head. She didn't fire back. She just breathed, slow and steady, the kind of breathing you hear from people who've carried weight heavier than ridicule. I'd seen her earlier that day on the O course, palms bleeding, sand grinding into her knuckles, tearing through the obstacles long after the rest of us dropped out. She ran like she was chasing something only she could see. She moved like her bones had been carved for endurance. And still, nobody respected her. Not yet. The nickname stuck fast, Queen, and the Marines used it like a weapon, shouting it across the beach, mumbling it under their breath during morning PT, laughing as though their voices shaped truth. But if they had ever bothered to watch her closely the way I did, they would have seen the tiny tells, the way her eyes sharpened when she heard their footsteps, the way her shoulders never slumped, the way she always trained 10 minutes longer than anyone else, the way she studied the instructor's movements like she was dissecting an equation. On that night, the night I now think of as the hinge the whole story swings on, we were doing endurance holds and simulated shipboarding drills. Maddox and his crew were swaggering, cracking jokes, treating the entire night like a playground despite the instructor's warnings. Jada stood alone on the far end of the deck, stretching quietly, her braid tucked neatly down her back, her expression unreadable. Maddox was especially loud, telling anyone who'd listen how ridiculous it was to have a little swimmer girl in BUD/S prep. "She'll be gone before Hell Week," he bragged. "Mark my words, boys, the Queen won't make it to sunrise one of these days." I caught the flicker in Jada's eye then. Just a flicker, a spark against all that calm. And for the first time I felt something shift in the air, something I couldn't name at the moment, but later learned to recognize as inevitability. The instructors blew the whistle, calling us into formation for night drills. The deck was cold under my boots, the Pacific air sharp enough to bite, and the moon hung low like a half-lidded eye watching everything unfold. I glanced at Jada. She stood perfectly still, perfectly balanced, her breath rising in small, controlled clouds. Maddox nudged one of his Marines and nodded toward her. "Watch this," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Hey, Queen, try not to drown tonight, all right?" More. Laughter. Even some of the candidates chuckled under their breath. But Jada, she didn't react. Instead, she glanced at the instructors with a focus so intense I felt myself shiver. Not from fear. No, not fear. From anticipation. As the drills began, I watched her move through the shadows with a kind of deliberate silence that didn't match her small frame. She wasn't fast, she was controlled. She wasn't flashy, she was precise. And every time Maddox or one of his boys crossed her path, her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a coil tightening, storing power. That night, standing under the red training lights, I knew none of us were seeing the full truth of her yet. We thought she was quiet because she was intimidated. We thought she avoided confrontation because she was soft. We thought she was alone because she couldn't keep up. But the truth was far stranger and far more dangerous than any of us realized. Jada Rivers wasn't struggling. She was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the ocean would rise, the instructors would step aside, and the night would tilt into darkness. Waiting for the chance to show the entire deck a version of herself none of us were prepared to witness. Waiting for the moment when 7 arrogant Marines would learn what happens when you corner someone who has already survived worse than your worst nightmare. And as the wind shifted and the moon dipped behind the clouds, I swear the whole base seemed to hold its breath, because whether we knew it or not, the Queen was about to stand up. I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I can admit, not because it was brutal, but because it was the moment everything we thought we understood about strength, discipline, and human limits was shattered by a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. The night drills had shifted into a full-contact, close-quarters combat scenario inside the rusted ship mock-up, a labyrinth of narrow hallways, slick metal grates, blind corners, and echoing chambers where sound traveled unpredictably, turning every footstep into a phantom. The instructors made the announcement casually, as if they hadn't just dropped a grenade into the atmosphere. Rivers, you'll run the course alone. The Marines are your opposing force. The base went still. 7 Marines. 1 candidate. No weapons. No backup. No mercy. Maddox smirked like he'd already won, rolling his shoulders as he stepped into the ship's entrance, his eyes gleaming with the kind of arrogance only men who've never truly lost carry. The others followed, joking among themselves, not realizing they were marching into a storm that had been gathering for months. Jada didn't blink. She just stepped forward when instructed, tightening her gloves with a slow precision, exhaling through her nose like she was letting go of whatever humanity she had tucked away for civility. The moment she disappeared into those red-lit corridors, I felt the air shift again, like a pressure drop before a lightning strike. Then the buzzer sounded. The ship swallowed the sound whole, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Then a thud, a grunt, a metallic clang. We pressed against the chain-link fence, straining to interpret the echoes. The first Marine's yelp came sharp and sudden, a cut-off sound of shock rather than pain. When the instructors projected the internal feed onto the screen, the image flickered to life just long enough to show Jada behind the Marine, her arm locked under his chin, her legs braced perfectly as she applied a choke, so clean it looked like choreography. He tapped, struggling for air, and she released him before the instructor even barked the command. She didn't celebrate. She didn't look at the camera. She just melted back into the shadows, vanishing around a bend with that same eerie calm. Somewhere deeper in the ship, another Marine shouted her nickname like a warning to the others, but the sound cut short with a sickening slam as she used the narrow hull to trap his momentum, flipping him over her shoulder and pinning him with a forearm across his collarbone. 2 down. The feed glitched, and we heard footsteps, heavy, frantic ones, as the remaining 5 Marines regrouped. Maddox ordered them to box her in, but it didn't matter. Jada anticipated their angles with the instinct of someone who had spent her entire life navigating tight spaces under pressure. When the 3rd Marine lunged, she didn't dodge. She stepped into him, ducked low, hooked her arm around his knee, and swept him so hard the metal deck rang. She transitioned into a shoulder lock before he could even process what happened. 3 down. But what terrified me most wasn't her speed. It was her expression. Cold, focused, controlled. Like she wasn't fighting them, she was dismantling them. The remaining Marines tried to flank her near the engine room, but she slipped between them like smoke. One grabbed at her from behind, and she countered by slamming him against the bulkhead, using the confined space to her advantage, her elbow driving into his ribs until he tapped out. 4. Another tried to pin her arms, but she dropped her weight, rolled out, and pivoted into a devastating sweep that sent him crashing into the railing. 5. At this point, the deck outside had gone silent. No jokes, no murmurs, just the quiet disbelief of grown men watching their assumptions unravel. Inside, the 6th Marine hesitated. I could see it in his stance, the doubt, the fear, the realization that she wasn't a novelty, or a token, or a diversity pick. She was a weapon forged from discipline and something deeper, something personal. He attacked anyway. She caught his wrist, twisted, and forced him down with a precision that made even the instructors exchange glances. 6. Then the feed cut again. When it returned, Maddox was alone, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his temples as he swept the corridor with frantic eyes. "Come on then, Queen," he shouted, voice cracking. "Show me what you got." And she did. She stepped into the red light behind him like a phantom summoned from the dark, her shadow rising before her. He swung first, a wild, desperate punch, but she slid under it, catching his arm, using his own weight to drag him forward as she wrapped around his back and locked in a rear choke so tight the veins in his neck bulged. He staggered, clawing at her forearm, then tapped violently, panic overriding pride. The buzzer blared through the ship. She released him gently, more gently than he deserved, and stepped back as he collapsed to his knees, gasping. When she emerged from the ship into the cold night air, she wasn't triumphant. She wasn't smiling. She was composed, breathing evenly, her posture tall, her eyes unshaken. The instructors stared at her like they were seeing something ancient and dangerous rise from beneath the surface of the ocean. Maddox stumbled out moments later, holding his throat, eyes wide with humiliation and awe. Nobody mocked her. Nobody laughed. Because the truth had finally settled over all of us. Jada Rivers wasn't the weakest link. She wasn't the underdog. She wasn't the queen they mocked. She was the reckoning. And that night, she didn't just beat 7 Marines. She rewrote the entire hierarchy of who we believed could lead, endure, and dominate under pressure. And we all knew the entire base would be talking about it by sunrise. Graduation morning had a strange stillness to it, the kind of quiet that feels almost rehearsed, as if the world itself understood the significance of what was about to occur and decided to lower its voice in respect. And I remember standing on the far end of the parade deck with the Pacific stretching endlessly behind us, the breeze cool against my face, the flags snapping sharply overhead. Everything about that moment felt unreal, as if someone had dialed the colors up a little too bright, the air a little too crisp, the horizon a little too perfect. Maybe that's what happens when you watch someone rewrite the limits of what you thought human beings could endure. Because in that formation, lined with men who had survived Hell Week, drown-proofing, cold water drills, brutal land navigation tests, and endless mental breaking points, stood Jada Rivers, now 29, the smallest in stature but easily the most immovable presence there, her expression steady and unreadable as she waited for the moment every SEAL candidate dreams of and fears in equal measure, the pinning of the trident. I could see, from where I stood, the faint shimmer of sweat across her brow, not from exertion but from the weight of the moment. The instructors moved down the line with deliberate pace, their silhouettes backlit by the morning sun until they seemed larger than life, and each time a trident was pinned to a chest, the crowd rippled with applause, pride mixing with relief like two currents converging into one. But when the instructors reached Jada, the air changed. Just slightly, just enough for every head in the audience to tilt forward, every camera to angle upward, every breath to stall in anticipation of what felt like a historic moment. Her name rang out, Petty Officer Jada Rivers, and the applause that followed wasn't explosive, wasn't wild, wasn't chaotic. No, it was reverent, deep, a wave of respect that rose from the very men who once predicted her failure, from those who had watched her train like she carried an invisible anchor, from instructors who had run programs for decades and still looked at her like they'd witnessed something impossible unfold. The trident gleamed against her uniform, catching a shard of sunlight and scattering it across the deck like a small explosion of gold. She didn't beam with triumph, didn't raise her chin in pride, didn't react at all except for the smallest, quietest inhale, the kind you take when you're grounding yourself, reminding your body it survived everything the world hurled at it. After the formation was dismissed, families rushed forward, candidates embraced one another with laughter and relief, instructors exchanged nods of acknowledgement, but Jada didn't move. She stood still, like she wasn't quite ready to step out of the moment, like she was stitching every detail into memory. Eventually, Maddox made his way toward her, moving slower than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders tight, his steps hesitant, as if he were approaching a sacred monument rather than a woman he once mocked. His crew trailed behind him, heads lowered, the cockiness wiped clean from their faces. "Rivers," he said, voice stripped bare, and the silence he stood in felt like a confession. "I meant what I told you months back. You earned this harder than any of us ever earned anything." His words hung there for a long moment, Jada's eyes softened, not with forgiveness, but with understanding, a deeper, quieter kind that doesn't need theatrics or grand gestures. Growth starts when the noise stops, she replied, and I swear the sentence seemed to echo, sinking into Maddox's expression with a weight he wasn't expecting. He nodded, jaw tight, and stepped back, giving her space. Not because he feared her, but because he respected her in a way he couldn't articulate. As the crowd thinned, Jada finally walked toward the shoreline, boots tucked under her arm, leaving footprints in the sand that the tide quickly claimed, as if even the ocean understood it was. Witnessing the beginning of a legacy. She stood at the water's edge, her trident catching the last blaze of afternoon sun, and for a long time she didn't speak, didn't move. She simply breathed, letting the waves lap around her ankles like a benediction. When I approached quietly, careful not to intrude, she didn't turn. She just said, almost as if speaking to the horizon, "They think I was fighting them that night." Her voice was calm, reflective, touched with something deeper than emotion. But I wasn't. I asked her what she meant, even though a part of me already knew. She said, "I was fighting everything I carried in." And suddenly, the night in the ship mock-up made sense in a way it hadn't before. Not just as an impressive display of combat skill or discipline, but as a release, a transformation, a moment where every wound, every doubt, every shadow from her past collided with the present, and she decided none of it would hold her hostage anymore. People would spend years telling the story, how a woman they called Queen stepped into a dark metal maze and emerged with the silence of 7 Marines behind her, how she endured every drill, every insult, every test not with loud defiance, but with unbreakable composure, how she became a SEAL not because she wanted to prove them wrong, but because something inside her needed to be rebuilt, reclaimed, resurrected. When she finally turned from the ocean and walked back toward the base, her silhouette framed against the burning sky, it hit me with a clarity that still sits in my chest like a heartbeat. Some legends roar their way into existence, but others, rare, powerful, unforgettable, rise quietly, steadily, like tides that reshape coastlines without a sound. And Jada Rivers was one of those tides, the kind that doesn't just change the landscape. It changes the men who once thought they understood what strength looked like. To this day, when people tell the story of the woman who took down 7 Marines alone, they speak of her like she was myth. But I know the truth. She wasn't myth. She wasn't miracle. She was the purest form of endurance, the kind of warrior who doesn't need crowns or thrones or cheers. Because the Queen didn't rise. She never had to. She was always already there,